Ladies and gentlemen, you may have heard about the proposed development on the green land between the two former garden centres in Windsor, the former ones at Squires and Wyvales. So this is coming to panel on the 1st of March this week, and we want to talk to you about what the issues are, what our thoughts are, and how you can have your say. Now, my name is Councillor Wisdom de Costa. I've been a councillor in Windsor since 2014, representing the residents in Cllr and Dedworth West in Windsor and formerly the residents in Cllr North. I've been on the planning panel since 2017. I'm a trustee on the Royal Berkshire Pension Fund since 2019. My focus areas are really climate change, biodiversity, governance and democratic process. I'm a corporate treasurer, an accountant, and a qualified teacher and a beekeeper. I've lived in Windsor since 2010. I'm a past chairman of the West Windsor Residents Association, and my wife is also Councillor Carol de Costa, who helps run the West Windsor Hub. Actually, she's their chair. So let's talk about the site. We're talking about this site, which is in the Borough Local Plan, site AL21, which, as you can see, stretches in the north from Squires all the way down to Wyvales and includes the parcel of land which straddles the A308. So it's quite a significant piece of land which used to be greenbelt, but was taken out of greenbelt by the Conservative Borough Local Plan. Sorry, I have to use that word. And now is open for development. So we can see that this is all ages settlement area, so there is a reason for a green belt, is to stop us molding or melding into what's happening in Bray and other areas like Holyport, so we keep our singular identity as Windsor. Now when we look at the green belt here, this AL21 site, you can see it in the background there, just highlighted in red. There are two different parts of the site, one of which is the northern part near the Willows and the Hatch, and the southern part is the near the Limes, Ruddles Way, and across towards Oakley Green. Now, we're looking at some very complex developments here, and they're so complicated that planners tend to split them, or rather developers tend to split them into two sections: outline, planning consent, and reserve matters. The reserve matters follows the outline, but we always start off with the outline. So we want to know that the current situation with the one being presented on the 1st of March is an outline planning consent. So what will be considered here, and what will be kicked into the reserve matters application, which has to follow 1 year, 2 years down the line? Okay, let's have a look. So when we look at the outline planning consent, there is one already in existence for Squires, and that was 220934 outline, which was heard in November. You can go and have a look at the RBWM planning portal and find out a bit more about what's been approved, and more importantly, what hasn't yet been approved, because all is not done, it's not all finished and done and dusted. Now here we're looking at the southern portion of the site, which is south of the A308, which, as I said, is straddled by or bound by the A308, Ruddles Way, the Limes, the Cardinal Clinic, really one of the premier establishments for dealing with mental health issues, especially for children in the south, in the UK. And of course, it's also bound by Oakley Green Road. Substantial piece of land, and you can imagine development here will take a while and have a number of issues. So there's no planning consent at the moment. There was one submitted back in November, but the EA, Environmental Agency, had some substantial concerns which have not yet been dealt with, because we're looking at floodplain here. It doesn't feel like floodplain, but actually it's fairly flat, close to the river. It's still part of the functional floodplain for exceptional 1 in 1,000 year, or maybe 1 in 100 year sort of events. So the EA have concerns that the previous discussions, their concerns were not validated, they haven't been actually assuaged, and they still haven't been satisfied in the current planning application, outline planning application, that's being presented on Wednesday. So we know that we've got a reserve matters application coming for the northern portion. When, we don't know, but it will happen sometime. And of course the southern application, as we said, the southern portion of the site, we're going to talk about this today, and the application that's been submitted, which will be heard by members, not me, I'm objecting to this, and you'll see why, but by other members on the 1st of March. So let's talk about outline planning applications. What should they consider? Well, according to RBWM and the officers we've spoken to, they should really just be looking at the principle of development and access to the site. And of course, access to the site is a huge issue here, because the access is proposed not onto the Maidenhead Road, but onto the Dedworth Road, at the narrowest section of the Dedworth Road. However, I consider that there are other aspects which we also need to be considering, which are not really being highlighted or clarified for the residents. And that is when we look at the NPPG, which is the National Planning Policy Guidance, and thank you to Adrian Waite for pointing this out, we also need to look at the general principles of how a site can be developed. Another issue is to do with the fact that HCLG, should I say, who run the planning sphere in the UK, they say that an applicant can choose to submit details of any other reserved matters as part of an outline application. So there's an area of uncertainty there already where the applicant has clearly submitted issues for consideration by the planners, which we haven't been clearly notified about, that these are reserved matters which are going to be considered now. There are other aspects of access which we need to consider. The National Planning Policy Framework, which is the primary legislation, sets out certain issues and they haven't maybe or maybe not been covered by our planners. There are also non-borough local plan clauses which indicate the intention of the borough local plan without necessarily being a policy. So, for example, health. What do we do about health and GP surgeries? Surely this is an issue we must consider now. And of course, other local authorities do it quite differently from the way RBWM do, so maybe we should be learning from them. So there we go, outline planning application, principal development, how a site can be developed, access, and anything else that the developer submits. Anything else, for example, appearance, means of access, landscaping, and layout and scale, need to be dealt with at the next stage, if of course this is granted an outline planning consent, which is the reserve matters application. So you can see it's clearly complex and there is certainly a lack of clarity which we have to put right for the sake of residents and participation of residents, i.e. democracy. We've covered this briefly a few seconds ago. An applicant can choose to submit details of any of the reserved matters as part of the outline application, and unless the applicant has indicated those details submitted for illustrative purposes only, the local authority has to treat them as part of the development in respect of which the application is being made. The local planning authority cannot reserve that matter by condition for subsequent approval. They have to deal with it when the developers send in their reports. And that's a major issue for our poor old planning department, who perhaps are under-resourced. Well, I certainly consider that, and many of you probably also consider that. So let's go on with the principle of development. Under the principle of development, I would consider that we need to look at the objectively assessed need, the nature of the site, and the information submitted by developers. And bear in mind that the information that the developer submits helps the developer frame the question, which is obviously very important. They set the agenda, when I think actually our planners shouldn't be just responding, but setting the agenda in advance so that we're not mullered or pushed into a corner. So we've talked about other aspects of access like the NPPF, non-BLP clauses, and local authority best practice. So this is how the developers are actually leading or framing the question and framing the issues for consideration. They've sent in 17 reports, 17 detailed reports, including the planning statement, design and access statement, transport assessment, framework, travel plan, air quality assessment, all the way down to surface water modelling, landscape and virtual assessment and ground investigation. That's a huge amount, and poor old residents have no hope of being able to deal with that volume of complexity. So I think it's important that the planners, our planning department, sets out a really clear agenda, how they're going to deal with this, their methodology and the framework, for them also to be in control, for our members who have to make decisions based on this complex series of reports, to help them frame their decision-making thinking, and of course definitely for residents. So this is how the RBWM planning officers have set out their thoughts for the time being in this report. They set out that they're going to look at the principle of the redevelopment of the site. Now they call it redevelopment because there are one or two little structures in there, and so really I consider this to be a fresh development. You can't say that one or two structures on a massive site constitute a redevelopment of the site when most of it was already green and already previously in greenbelt. They're going to look at climate change and sustainability, affordable housing, flooding, sustainable drainage, highway safety, design and character, the impact on heritage assets, impact on the amenity of neighbouring buildings, and what they consider to be other material considerations, even at this stage, which again sounds a little bit odd. these are our comments. Pardon me for the little ding-dong. It's time to go. Let's get going. Now, here are our comments on the principle of development. In relation to the objectively assessed need, we already consider that we already have achieved acceptable housing numbers given previous consent, and I'm sad to say it, also the consent that was awarded last week at the Maidenhead Golf Club, which is a tragedy, but it is what it is. We're there. We don't need now to build on this piece of green land in Windsor. So we need to refuse this. We don't have to do it. Also, very recently, Michael Gove, the MP, who's also in charge of MHCLG, proposed an insertion into the National Planning Policy Framework, which says for plan making would prevent LPAs from having to meet housing need in full. When doing so would mean building densities that are significantly out of character with the existing area. You've seen our existing area. It's green. So this development is clearly significantly out of character with the existing area, and we're over above our housing numbers proportionately. So really, Michael Gove, thank you very much, sir. I never thought I'd ever say this to you. Thank you for this, but we don't need to build. We should refuse. Really, really clear. We're going to move on to some of the policies from the Borough Local Plan, the BLP, which also help inform the decision about whether or not we should, in principle, have any development or some of the issues relating to development. So the BLPIF 2.2 talks about that the site should be near where residents are employed. This is clearly not the case here. None of the residents here are going to be employed locally. They're going to be employed in the centre of Windsor or probably in towns far away. So I would consider that we fail this test. This site is located far from the town centres where people will be employed. A really important thing to consider when framing the issue of Policy SB2 on climate change is that Policy SB2 is about what happens on a site once you decide to develop it. I would suggest that we are unable to comply with Policy SB2 because this site has already been designed to incorporate measures, which says you need to design needs to incorporate measures to adapt to and mitigate climate change. But this proposal is actually destroying a valuable climate change mitigation site. Already this site is in existence, which absorbs the effects of surface water which could arise from extremes of precipitation. When we look at climate change, some of the things that are going to happen is that there's going to be, and we're seeing it already, more increased times of heavy rain, heavy snow. We're going to have longer, hotter summers. We're going to have drought, and we're going to have also colder winters. So we've got this mix of extremes of temperature, and this site, by the very fact that it is a floodplain, will absorb water and retain water. It stops that water from flowing directly straight off the surface into the drains and, more importantly, into the rivers. And of course the drains end up in the rivers anyway. So it prevents flooding by holding back that water. It holds back that water and also provides in the heat of the summer, when we have 40 and 50 degree heat, areas of cool, which allows the water to evaporate very slowly, which keeps the environment cool. So you've got this area which is perfect for climate mitigation, yet we're looking to destroy it. So I think by the fact that we're trying to destroy an area, you can't possibly say that this has got anything to do with climate change. You cannot say that whatever you put in place will be better than the site you've got already in terms of climate change. So I contend that we're unable to comply with Policy SB2 on climate change. I also contend we're unable to comply with Policy QP2 in as much as we're destroying existing blue and green infrastructure and not replacing it with a similar amount of blue and green infrastructure. I believe it fails to comply with the natural resources policies, NR2, 2A, 2C, 2D, 3, 5A, 5B, 5C, 5D, 5E, 5F, 5G. We have a complete and entire ecosystem here, which has got biodiversity below ground in decomposers and above ground in terms of the producers and the plants, which are the food sources for the consumers and the mammals and the birds that will feed from this. So we are taking away an entire ecosystem above ground and below ground. Really important to understand that it's a below ground and above ground. So this is also going to have a negative impact on the wider connected ecosystem in the River Thames Basin and the Sutherland Grange, where you would have had insects, birds and mammals grazing on this piece of land. They're going to be displaced. Where they're going to go to, well, they're possibly going to go to Sutherland Grange and any other small bits of green that are available. What we're basically saying is we're putting increased pressure on these other areas, Sutherland Grange, and increased pressure on the biodiversity. So what's going to happen is that these animals, these creatures, will die out because the volume of food we are providing for them by removing this huge site, by very fact that we're removing a site, they're going to be less food sources for them. They will die out. So we're actually destroying, in that case, biodiversity. Now, when we look at the fragmenting of habitat, this is part of a much wider ecosystem, the River Thames Basin, which has already been fragmented to an extent by the, producing a road like the 308 or any of the roads that we put in place or any of the buildings. So already starting to fragment this ecosystem, yet we're now fragmenting it even more by removing a component or proposing to remove a component of this system. So again, all of these fail to comply with our existing policies. Another important thing is that it destroys the soil resources, and these are all words that are used in the local plan that protect below and doesn't protect below the ground biodiversity. It's actually destroying it all. The soil resources are vital for the below ground biodiversity, like fungi and bacteria, and what they do is they destroy, or they break down all of the nutrients, the dead plants, dead animals, the poo and all that stuff that ends up in the soil, and recycle that so that the plants can then take up those nutrients and then start to grow again. In addition to that, these below soil resources actually store much of that biomass which was now dead, so it stores the carbon. So you've got huge amounts of carbon stored underground. Now, another aspect of this is, as we're moving on, is that the policies ask planners or other developers to compensate for extents for these issues. I can see nothing in their proposals that compensates for these huge losses. And again, I consider that in that case that we should reject this application because it doesn't comply with our policy NR2 in any way, shape or form. Let's move on to the failures of the developers to comply with policy NR3, in as much as it needs to minimize it is minimizing the opportunity for tree planting, it's reducing the open character of the edge of settlement, and it's destroying the trees and hedgerows, and doesn't seek to replace these trees and hedgerows. And remember, it's no good replacing a 100-year-old tree with all of the thousands and thousands of species that they support with a 2-year-old tree. It doesn't make sense. So we have to look at this in terms of weight for weight, biomass for biomass. So a 50-year-old tree, you might want to replace it with 100 one-year-old trees or 200 one-year-old trees. So we've got to consider this bigger picture, the reality of how life works and how the system works. So they do not seek to replace like for like. I have not seen this biomass with biomass, any of the trees they propose to remove. Next, the key policy here is NR 3.7. Now this actually says the amenity value of trees, woodlands and hedgerows, if they outweigh the justification for development, planning permission may be reviewed. Now when I look at the value of the trees and woodland and hedgerows, I would say the amenity value isn't just for us looking at it, but it's going to be the value to society and to nature and to the populations on a longer term basis. The value that these trees and this woodland and this area of biodiversity, this natural climate change mitigation site, brings to the environment and to our locality. So I would suggest that planning policy NR 3.7 says planning permission may be refused, and I think we should take them up on it. Let's refuse it. Let's move on to failure to comply with Cllr 1.A. This application does not demonstrate how it plans to allow residents adequately survive the experienced and predicted impact of climate change on extended periods of time or extreme temperatures, 40 plus. We've already had that. Now we're talking about 45 degrees. That's going to be the next target within the next 10 years. Minus 10 degrees, snow, rain. These are already causing excess deaths. Let me say that again. This extreme heat and extreme cold are already causing thousands and thousands of excess deaths in the UK because our homes cannot cope with these extremes. So we really need to understand how they will comply with Cllr 1A in a way that people who buy these houses will survive in them and be able to survive in the extremes that are not just predicted but are already happening These are predictions from people like the Met Office. So we're not talking about numpties or fly by night guys. We're talking about real credible people who are saying this is going to happen, and they're saying, actually, do you know what? It's worse than we thought it was going to be. So it fails to comply with QR1A. It doesn't demonstrate how residents will be adequately protected, and so should be rejected. Unless, of course, no, I think it just frankly should be rejected. It also fails to comply with QP1, 2F, G, and H, in that it is not fostering or conserving, but it's actually destroying green space above and below the ground, biodiversity, blue and green infrastructure, and is also, when we look at item H, harming a historical wall. We're not conserving it, we're harming it. We're not conserving biodiversity, we're harming it. We're not adding blue and green infrastructure, we're removing it in a huge way. So because of these failures, I believe that this application should be rejected. Let's move on from the principle of planning as to why, whether or not we should be building in this sort of an area. And the answer is clearly no, to looking at also the issues of access. How do we actually get into and out of this site if it was appropriate to build? Now, we don't have much in the borough local plan which talks about the nature of good access. So we have to look to key principles set out by Natural Highways England, and they talk about road design and the good principles, or the 10 key principles of good road design. Now, looking at the access, the narrow access onto a narrow section of the Dedworth Road, which is already beside a new exit for Aldi, it is impossible to regard this road as appropriate for this access. So I think we should reject this in relation to the key principles set out by Natural Highways England. It's not a safe and useful road. It is not inclusive. A number of people will be excluded because of the danger of moving across that road and on the pavements, which are also narrow. The roads will not be understandable because you have two exits and entrances right within 10 yards of each other, Aldi and this proposed site. It doesn't fit in with the context of a rural area which is very green, but it's adding huge amounts of extra traffic. And in the context of the extra traffic, it is also environmentally unsustainable because you're going to be adding, perhaps 800, 1,200 vehicle movements in and out of the site during busy times, and there could be at least 2 busy times. So, and this is because of the number of houses, the number of people living in those houses, the number of cars that each of those people will have, i.e. each of those households will have, the lack of availability of green public transport, or any public transport for that matter, and the distance from any form of train station. Fundamentally, we're talking about car usage. Car usage in this country is fundamentally petrol driven and diesel driven, which means that 1,200 movements per busy period, or 2,000 to 3,000 a day when the school's in full operation, we're talking about a lot of pollution there. So I think environmentally this is absolutely unsustainable, the access in specifically we're talking about now. Again, I think this fails to provide good, appropriate access to the Dedworth Road. When you look at the turning radiuses, it's 6 metres. When you look at a bus, that if you were to have a bus, and I think you would have to have a buses going into and out of the site, and certainly you'd have buses taking the special needs children into and out of the site. And even if they don't have buses, you've got large SUVs who will be ferrying children into and out of the site. Each child will probably have their own taxi or own parent taking the person in, because they're sure as heck not going to be walking in or cycling in, because they are special needs children. God love them, but they are not going to have that level of ability. So the turning circle of 6 metres, radius of 6 metres, is not large enough. We'd need at least 7 metres. So already we're setting this up to fail with buses and SUVs and ambulances. I'm sad to say that ambulances will be regular visitors to the school. It's not good enough. We should fail this just on the basis of this aspect of the access as well. Again, when we look at the volume of traffic on a narrow road, on a rural road, we are talking about 1,600 vehicle movements at a peak. As I said, that includes special educational need, transport, ambulances, lorries, cars, people going to and from work, going to school, going shopping, school outside of this site. The road is not wide enough to deal with the traffic, to the volume. It's not wide enough at the moment to deal with the volume, let alone when you include Aldi in that situation and people who are going to and from Braywood School. Now, point 14, I think the road also fails on due to the fact that the volume of traffic at busy times is likely to result in congestion and pollution. And this is going to have an impact on the SEND students. If you have 600 traffic cars each way or 800 cars each way, vehicles held up, unable to get onto the Dedworth Road, they're going to be not idling, but certainly chucking out a lot of pollution, and that pollution will drift across the site. So this is a pollution hotspot in the making if we actually approve it as it is. The road, Dedworth Road, has to be widened for this to happen, and that turning radius has to be widened, and the size of the roads within the site have to be widened. This has not been provided for in the plan, so should be failed. I think the plan should also be failed because it fails to comply with IF 2.2, in that we're required to develop a safe and comfortable environment for pedestrians and cyclists. Whereas if you've got narrow roads, very narrow roads, narrow pavements, and you have cars who are unable to exit the site without actually clipping the pavements or crossing into the oncoming carriageway, there's no way I can see that this is a safe environment or a comfortable environment for pedestrians and cyclists. Add to that, on top of that, the pollution from cars being held up on site as they try to get out into this narrow road. And I think this is a clear failure to comply with IF 2.2. So I summarise that with a failure to comply with IF 2.3a, b, d, e and f, given the existing narrow roads and pavements in the surrounding network and the extra volume of traffic. Finally, if I look at the wider area of access, let's talk about access to health. The BLP clause 3.4.6 talks about the requirement to give people good health coverage. And you're right, we do. We need good medical support. Absolutely. But there's only one medical centre in Dedworth. There's only one GP practice within almost 2 miles. So where are these people going to go to for their medical help, for their GPs? It's going to be a big problem. So I think we have to fail it just because there's no provision within the plan to provide for a new GP surgery or even an infrequent GP surgery. There's nothing there. We can't ask them to put it in as a condition. It needs to fail. It needs to come back with a better planning outline policy application. Now let's move on to the National Planning Policy Framework, which is the big daddy, if you like, of the planning world. It dictates everything that happens, and it trumps everything that's going around any local plan, any neighbourhood plan, or any form of planning. So when we look at the NPPF Clause 98, this outline planning application fails to provide high quality open spaces and opportunities for sports and physical activity. You've got more people coming on site, and we're also going to be having people building on the manors, and that's 1.5 miles or so away. So Sutherland Grange is going to be overloaded, and Sutherland Grange is a nature reserve. And then when you look at the main site of Sutherland Grange, that also is being turned to more of a nature reserve. So there is increasing pressure and on the existing resources already before you then add another 320 houses. As well as whatever's happening on the north side and happening on the Squires side. So this site really needs to cumulatively provide high quality open spaces and opportunities, if nothing else, for the people who live on that site, and it doesn't. It needs to be failed. This also fails to comply with NPPF clause 110.b, which, when you're considering development proposals, the proposal is unable to demonstrate that safe and suitable access to the site can be achieved for all users because the roads are narrow, because the pavements are narrow, because you've got huge amounts of traffic which will compromise cyclists, people walking, people even using e-scooters. I'm not saying I propose e-scooters, but it's going to cause a problem. So because of that, it's unable to comply with safe and suitable access. I think it needs to fail. We look at NPPF clause 102.a, and this also, it does not provide access to high quality public transport. One, it doesn't actually make the provision. Secondly, then the roads are too narrow and there's no provision to widen the roads. As I said, buses are as wide, if not wider, than the roads. And when you look at their turning radius, they would definitely cross far across the carriageway. So we're talking about more congestion, more traffic, potential hazards, potential accidents. So we need to fail this also on the NPPF clause 112A. Let's look at NPPF clause 154A. By building on a site with its open green water retention features, it increases the risk of climate change and removes existing climate change mitigation features from the local area. Now, I know this crosses over with some of our BLP clauses in SP2 and NR3 and NR4. Nevertheless, it is a big daddy of a clause, and if only for this big daddy of a clause, as well as our own BLP clauses, it should be failed. The application also fails to comply with NPPF clause 154B in as much as it increases greenhouse gas emissions both offensively by releasing vast amounts of greenhouse gases during the construction phase, but also it then prevents absorption from embodiment of the biodiversity above the ground and below the ground. Basically, what we're saying is that it's digging up the biomass that was there, releasing the carbon to the environment. It's stopping plants from growing across the whole site. So what is happening is that the ability of absorbing carbon, of taking carbon out of the environment, is reduced because there's nothing green there anymore, very little green, and certainly nowhere near as much green growing as there was before. So we're actually removing a greenhouse gas absorbing site. So for that reason, it should fail clause 154B. So you can probably guess our conclusions. Our conclusions, we believe, demonstrates that the outline proposal 220135 out complies with only one aspect of the principle of development, namely it's included in the borough local plan. But it fails to comply with 5 NPPF clauses, recent government pronouncements, National England Highways principles, fails to comply with 9 borough local plan policies, and it fails to comply with the intentions set out in the narrative of the borough local plan. For example, access to health, really important. So on balance, we consider that substantial harm will be caused by granting outline planning permission, which cannot be dealt with by reserved matters or extra planning conditions. We have to consider what's presented before us. So this is not outweighed by the benefits. It is causing a lot of harm. Reject it. Let them come back with a new application and deal with these issues effectively. So we've set these reasons out in the body of our response. But we've tried to make this easy for panel members because this is complicated. It's taken me weeks and weeks of research, talking to residents, talking to experts, talking to parish councillors, talking to planning officers, and going back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. It's complicated. So members who have not done that level of research, what we've done is we've included with our own submission an Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Now we really, really hope that you do the right thing and that they will refuse this outline planning application. They can come back again, submit another outline planning application, make it better, make it more appropriate. What's the obscene race to get this done now before the election? I wonder. Anyway, it's just to help out, we've said that we've set out the reasons for refusal because it is complicated. You want to make sure that the reasons are reference every single planning document, whether it's the MHCLG, whether it's the National Planning Policy Framework, whether it's the Borough Local Plan, whatever it is. We've set out the reasons for refusal and we've referenced them for you so that the members can only have to cut and paste it and stick it into their rejection letter. And then we have a very defendable rejection letter just in case the developers are minded to go to a judicial review. Easily defendable from what I can see. We have so many reasons, justifiable, strong reasons to vote against this. However, we are aware that something strange in the minds of people is going on here. And just in case they do decide to approve it, it's a rubbish application, let's face it. It's going to cause a lot of harm to people. So we will include in our own submission to the planning authority just a set of conditions which say if you are minded to approve, then you must include these conditions to try and make, well, we can't really make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, but we can certainly try and limit some of the harm that this application clearly will bring to the table. Okay, so closing comments. The design of the process for the outline planning applications seems to give the upper hand to well-funded developers and certainly not to ordinary residents like you and I. And it's us, the local residents, who's likely to suffer the impacts of poor developments. Now, we consider the process followed by RBWM to be unnecessarily obscure and unhelpful for citizens acting in good faith. We believe that there are some simple fixes that the council can implement which would make the process clearer so that we understand what's going on, when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. More timely, so we know when things are going to happen, and we know when we can start our research, and where we can get the information from, and how to respond. And therefore it will become more democratic for us ordinary people, so we can participate in the process without feeling as if there's something weird going on, backhanders going on, or anything like that. Because these are the comments I'm getting as I talk to residents up and down Windsor. It may be true, it may not be true. If it's not true, we can take steps to make it clear that this process is a good process, but we need to take some steps. Let me give you an idea. We can publicise. We can put out the publication of clear methodologies for assessment, so we know how we're going to deal with one type of report or another type of report. We can say this is our methodology for dealing with the principles of planning. What are the key issues? Let's list them. When we look at access, what are the issues? How will you incorporate Natural Highways England? List what you're going to look at, or the sort of areas you're going to look at, so everybody knows what's going on. And I think this should be notified to the public when all the reports are in, when there is a cut-off point, at least a month before the planning meeting. So residents know, a month before the planning meeting. Meeting's happening on the 1st of April. It's now the 1st of March. Oh, great, we've got enough time to think about this and talk to our councillors and talk to experts. This will all help the process, make it clearer, and restore trust, improve the confidence of residents in the process, because right now the confidence of residents is pretty low. Okay, we've come to the end of the session. So if you want to make a submission, this is how you do it. You can do it online. Just follow that link. You can email planning@rbwm.gov.uk, or you can send your comments to planning services at the Royal Borough of Windsor Maidenhead, Town Hall, St Ives Road, Maidenhead, SL61RF. Now, clearly, before you do that, I would suggest look at this presentation again, have a look at our objections, have a look at some of the other objections online. You can go to the planning portal, which is there, rbwm/home/planning/find-planning-application. You can find out more information there. For example, have a look at Bray Parish Council. They're usually pretty good. The West Windsor Residents Association website, westwindsorresidentsassociation.org.uk. You can look at the WWA Facebook page, which is West Windsor Residents at Facebook, or you can email me, councillor.dacosta@rbwm.gov.uk. Right, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this presentation helpful. Feel free to listen, re-listen, re-record, and also click on some of those links to the websites to download some of the resources. Look, good luck with your submissions, and I'm going to be there on the 1st of March. I encourage you to be there the 1st of March at York House. I will possibly be making submission in person, or have a representation in person, or speaking clearly against the application in person. Then again, I might do it by video link, because I will be at a conference in London on pensions. Thank you very much for listening and watching. Good luck, guys. Remember, we're all in this together. We'll fight this together. Bye-bye.